Welcome to today's webinar. This is Mark Diamond from Contoural, and today we're going to talk about the difference between information governance and data governance. It's interesting within enterprises, within information governance and IT, we're really seeing two trends beginning to emerge. Clearly, the trend around data governance and driven by big data and other areas like that are having a lot of organizations focus their IT energies and what they want to do and understanding how they can leverage more data out there. And we also see the trend of information governances, which is how do we get better control of what we have? Are these really the same thing? Are they different? Which groups should be able to manage these? Which groups are best suited to do these? Is there any overlap? Today we're going to take a look at what's the difference between what is often a very confusing area between legal and records management and IT, and it usually comes from the form between the difference between information governance and data governance. Today's webinar will be recorded, and it will be available for replay. So we also have the ability to ask questions on the site, so take a look at the chat box. If you have a question, post your question in the chat box, and we'll be queuing up those questions and answering some of them during the webinar, as well as being able to answer all the questions at the end. So we'll get through. We have a very big turnout today. My name is Mark Diamond. I'm founder and CEO of Contoural. And we are the largest independent provider of information governance consulting services. I should mention that we are independent. We have clients all over the world, so we can't favor any particular country. And so we'll just congratulate all the countries that made it to the World Cup finals, advanced in the World Cup, including those World Cup countries that just barely squeaked by. All right, what's the difference between information governance and data governance? And a lot of times we find that this comes up more as a discussion between two different groups, where maybe an organization is thinking about creating an information governance committee, and they reach out and say to IT, hey, we're putting together an information governance committee, do you want to be part of it? And IT says, well, information governance, what will that do? And well, it's about control. It's information retention, discovery, privacy, collaboration. And a lot of times, maybe they say, well, we already have a group like that. It's called our data governance group. Matter of fact, the data governance group has been around for a long time, and we have this working group that's been in place for at least a year now. Why are you creating a duplicate committee when we already have a committee to be able to do that? It comes back and says, well, no, information governance is actually different. I mean, it's a different, we're about control of information, or we're about record retention and data privacy, and the response is, well, that actually sounds pretty familiar. I mean, that's what we're doing. I mean, we're doing the same thing. So this goes back and forth, and, the CIO gets involved, the GC gets involved, and what's the difference? And a lot of conversation, very typically we see across a lot of organizations. And quite frankly, a lot of people are trying to figure this out. Are these the same things, or is this something that's actually different? And so let's go a little bit deeper in there. And if we look at what the discussion is, there's a lot of different components to both of these, whether it's record retention or litigation readiness or master data management or big data or enterprise content management or structured data. Let's throw in data security, and a lot of back and forth, and who's going to handle what, or are these the same thing? Or more important, a lot of times the question is, can you drive, or should you drive what you're calling information government through master data management? Well, don't we want a master data management, and maybe information governance will be a subset of that? And then the response back is, well, no, because master data management is about the database data. It's not about the other part of it. And so, again, I will say we work with a lot of different companies, and some of them have very mature practices in both of these areas, but we see, quite frankly, some colliding of these areas, and sometimes some conflict, because let's be honest, what are the issues behind this? This supposed conflict is, well, who's going to get the ability to make recommendations, and quite frankly, which group is going to be able to get the funding to be able to execute their initiatives if there's competing? And today's webinar, we're going to talk about, we don't really think that there is a lot of competition between these two areas, that actually we think they're different, and they're very complementary. There's a little bit of overlap, but we find out there's more complementary activities than there is overlap between them. And many organizations may want to have one approach or one committee, but oftentimes having separate groups may be more effective. But key is to understanding the difference between these two. So Okay, if we wanted to solve the debate between information governance and data governance, what a lot of organizations do is they will jump in and they will go take a look at what's the definition of each. And we'll start out in the world of information governance. You know, it's the old joke. You know, the advantage of so many standards in the technologies industry is that there are so many to choose from. And you could say the same thing about definitions around information governance. Information governance, we find a number of definitions. Probably the most prominent is Deborah Logan from Gartner, who described it as really a set of multidisciplinary structures, policies, procedures, and processes that cover regulatory, risk, environment, and operational requirements. I think I know what that means. I mean, it's a fairly broad definition. Or you look at ERM, which is a framework of responsibility model for cross-functional and executive dialogue, or a Forrester that describes it as a holistic approach to managing and leveraging information. It's interesting. Information governance is being born out of some very specific activities. It's being born out of records and information management. It's being born out of litigation readiness. It's being born out of defensible disposition. It's being born out of productivity and collaboration and disposition. But what these definitions are reaching for is a wider, broader term of what actually describes it. And I'll make this comment. I think one of the faults of the information governance community today is spends an awful lot of time trying to define what information governance is versus describing what information governance does. And having been in the technology industry many, many years, it always worries. Anytime you spend a lot of time trying to define something and describe it versus actually doing it, I think that's a little bit of a yellow flag to say, do we really know what we're doing or what we're trying to approach with this? So if we can't really get a really good grounding on what information governance is solely by the definition, and again, those aren't bad definitions, but again, how informative are they? Can we get a better idea of information governance on what it does? And as I alluded to a little bit earlier, we believe that information governance really comes down to 5 different drivers. And we think that these are key to defining an effective information governance strategy. The first one is legal and compliance. How can we ensure compliance with legal and regulatory record-keeping requirements? There's obviously a lot of rules and regulations on a worldwide basis. The typical Fortune 500 can face as many as 20 to 30,000, and I'll say that again, 20 or 30,000 different regulations mandating record-keeping requirements based, and some of them are general, some of them are industry-specific, some of them are for publicly traded companies, some of them are for all organizations. Many different rules that require organizations to maintain records, and in some cases defining accessibility requirements for those records based on the information that they have. And so clearly this is historical records management applied not only obviously to paper but electronic information. Okay, so part of it is we got to be compliant. If a regulator comes in or if we end up in court for some reason, we need to be able to show that we knew the rules and we're following the rules and we're following the right rules. Next area is optimized discovery. And optimized discovery we sometimes call litigation readiness, which is not what happens when you get sued, but how do we proactively reduce the risk and cost for discovery? What is it that we can do so if and when litigation or regulatory inquiry strikes, it's not going to be so expensive, it's not going to be so risky in the case that we miss something. Doesn't end there. Privacy and security. Organizations have sensitive information. They have privacy, they have PCI, they have PHI, they have intellectual property, they have corporate confidential information. This sensitive information lives, some cases, all over the place. Some of it lives in databases, but some of it lives in unstructured or email and some places where it shouldn't live. How do we know what we have? How can we identify where it is? And how can we ensure that we're managing it appropriately? We're managing it securely, and we're managing it in a way that in many cases, and this is a current requirement, is we can get rid of it when we want to. Much of information governance, when they look at this, focuses typically or historically on the semi-structured or the unstructured data, less on the structured database data, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But that's probably the biggest area of overlap between information governance and data governance is privacy and security. Doesn't end there. A big area historically of information governance has been productivity and collaboration. How do we make our employees more productive when sharing and managing information? I mean, this is a key driver that employees create information, and with a bad information governance strategy, everybody has their own little silo of information, which drives, when somebody leaves the organization, it has to be reinvented because there's no effective or practical way for sharing that. The other risk is not only turnover, but just, 5,000 employees, 5,000 different individual silos of information. And so some of that information would benefit the organization if we can share and collaborate. So we see that as a driver around information governance. And finally, a big issue that, this stuff, information, both paper and especially electronic information, accumulates. And so this ongoing accumulation of data piling up and piling up and piling up actually hurts the top four. It hurts our compliance. It definitely hurts discovery. It puts privacy and security in risk. And it actually, when employees spend a lot of time finding the right version of the document, finding a document, if there's too much, it impacts productivity. So again, there are many different definitions for information governance out there. You can pick your definition, what you want. But at the end of the day, we think that these 5 drivers describe well what a good information governance program will do. It will make you compliant, reduce the cost and risk in discovery, help you make sure that you can manage your privacy and other sensitive information securely. It's really a boon to productivity, and you do it in a way that data does not pile up. So that's how we're going to describe information governance from a program. And typical information program elements, and again, this is an area that's expanding in some of these areas, but everything from record retention policy and schedules to data privacy policies to legal hold, data security classification, development, email usage, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Some of the processes around this is obviously record retention and something we call data placement or the data disposition or the legal hold, classification, legacy document management are some of the processes, clearly important processes. Some of the sample technology tools, beginning to see a little bit of enterprise content management, so I've been there around, email archiving, document management, e-discovery, data classification tools, data discovery tools. There's a whole area of technology. And by the way, we're also seeing a bit of, not a collision, but different types of data governance tools could also potentially be used for information governance and vice versa. Again, just adding to the confusion of the debate. As well as training and behavior change management. That's a very important part of, getting employees to follow good practices and saving the right stuff in the right places, which not only helps our audit compliance, but and discovery, but also makes them more productive. And so, again, there's no such thing as the standard tasks around information governance, but we find that these are the typical tasks that most organizations will do some or all of these to help drive a successful information governance program. And so remember these, because we're going to come back to these when we compare a little bit when we talk about what's part of the data governance strategy. All right, so Data Management Association is probably the leader in our view in talking about what comprises data governance, and they describe it as a framework for managing all data within the organization. My response to that is, okay, so what does that mean? Data governance is a set of processes that ensure that important data assets are formally managed throughout the enterprise. Okay, that sort of seems the same thing. What we're seeing in terms of definitions, both for information governance and data governance, is that both beginning to realize that their purview is expanding, so they're getting very, very broad definitions. But I'll make the argument that the definitions end up being so broad as not being terribly meaningful, or at least not being meaningful if we're trying to differentiate information governance from data governance. And so, again, these broad definitions sort of give maybe the Data Governance Committee license to say, no, that's part of our initiative, or the information governance people to say, no, that's what we're doing. And so, interesting comment here, and I agree with this comment very much, is that data governance has long been associated with structured data. It's long been associated with relational databases and the applications that sit on databases, and much of what we see around data governance is still focused, we'll talk about this a little bit, around the structured data. However, what we're seeing data governance beginning to do is to move a little bit more upstream and look at the unstructured data, look at the files, the images, the documents, and in some cases a little bit the semi-structured data out there too, saying, hey, this is part of our strategy, because organizations are trying to get more control, which is a good thing, over all of their data, but it's important to recognize that data governance is coming really from a database or structured data type of orientation. What drives data governance? Well, again, your mileage may vary, but typically what drives data governance is, the first and foremost, is maximizing income generation potential of data. How can you interact with your customers more? How can you understand your supply chains? How can you understand pricing? How can you leverage all the data within your organization to make better business decisions that could make your business more efficient and more effective? This is big data. And again, big data is, well, as opposed to just keeping data in a single database, maybe we can tap multiple databases. Maybe we can tap multiple applications. Matter of fact, let's not stop there. Let's tap databases. Let's also tap our unstructured data files. And maybe, in fact, we can, maybe we can tap in social media feeds and other things like that. And so, but the big driver, again, is really as core business initiatives saying we need to make better decisions, whether it's about marketing or whether it's about consumer outreach or whether it's about pricing, and we need to leverage all the data doing that. And to do that, as soon as we tap into multiple data sources, we're realizing that, having increasing consistency and confidence in corporate decision-making, it's the consistency part of that ends up being very important because, when we all, when organizations lived and breathed off of enterprise resource management program, when it was SAP, Oracle Financials, there was sort of one source of truth. But what's happening is that there's a lot of different applications that are growing up, and well, we can't depend on just one application. We need to go into more, and that then drives improving data security and quality because we've got different data in different places, and some of this is very sensitive information, and likewise, how many different versions of truth, how many different places we have information out there. And likewise, it's supposed to have separate groups, optimize staff effectiveness, and then how do we measure if we're getting smarter about this? How do we measure if we're getting better about this? How do we measure how well we can interact with our customers, or are we getting the best price? And so one of the big parts that I think data governance has done very well is establishing these baselines to measure the effectiveness of the programs. I'll take a break here, and I'll say, if you look at the world of data governance and you look at the world of, what does it do? The definitions, those don't move me, but if you start looking at what drives each of them, we find these both to be fairly different between the two of them. And again, some overlap, and I'll argue complementary, but a little bit different between them. So governance activities, and again, there's a whole lot of activities out there, and in part these are big areas, whether it's the data quality or the data modeling or the metadata management, big area. Security and privacy, a big area. How do we know what, where's our sensitive information? Are we being compliant with regulations? Are we being compliant with international data transfer? Do we have some data standards to be able to do that? Who owns the data? What are the business rules? How do we manage the workflow? And there are lots of big projects out there around data governance. And again, the typical big projects are big data or master data management. How do we define, how do we define what data is the right data and what's the master data, and how do we make all other data and make sure that it's consistent with our data? Where is our master data, and how do we enhance consistency throughout this? Business intelligence is a big part of this, enterprise resource management, data migration or data integration, all different parts of data governance. And again, who knows where data governance is going? Who knows where information governance is going to head also? And an argument can be made to say, well, this is where data governance is today, and yes, data governance is separate than information governance, but where data governance is going tomorrow is maybe what information governance activities are today, or vice versa. So I'm not sure I buy this. To be honest, I think that if work with a lot of CIOs, CIO may look at this and say, this is a pretty full plate of activities. Let's get doing this fairly well, which will help drive our strategy going forward. So to be honest, I don't see a lot of organizations expanding their data governance. They may be staking claims on a wider area, but what they're actually executing tends to be this set of activities out there. And again, everybody's different. Somebody can come up with an exception. And the same thing from information governance. The set of activities that I defined for information governance, that's also a pretty full plate of things that organizations need to do. So what's an example of master data management? And this is a great example. Processes to ensure that critical data is defined and managed as a single point of reference. And the classic example of this is, who is our customer? Customer takes out a mortgage, and while making mortgage payments, that same customer receives solicitations from the same bank saying, hey, why don't you take a mortgage out with us? And obviously, that's not only wasted marketing cycles, because you're trying to sell to somebody that has already bought from you, if you will. But that also raises concerns among your customers, saying their advertising brochure said that they knew me, but do they really know me? Because obviously they don't. And clearly what happens is the marketing organization's data, which may be in a completely separate application, a different database, driven from completely different data feeds, is not integrated with the customer service group. And the customer service group may have this information, but the twain shall never meet. Or good master data management wants to solve this problem. It wants to go out within and saying, can we have that? By the way, the classic master data management problem is the customer address. How many different places do you have your customer's address? And if I were to say 30 or 40, for most of those listening in on this webinar, that would probably not be terribly far off. Many different places that you can have this information. And when it's different, it creates risk. The other problem, of course, is, we'll talk about this, is master data management then begets another problem, which is, how can I use this data? What are my privacy requirements, especially when we start looking at EU data privacy? Am I allowed to use this data? And am I treating it respectively? Or if I get the data from someplace else, does it look like I'm using my customer data? Again, lots of very interesting issues here. Some intersection around privacy and how we use that. But again, I'll say it's master data management, as we've described it here, is a little different than historical records management or historical enterprise content management. Enterprise content management has a slightly different but similar sounding problem. Enterprise content management may say, hey, I've got 15 versions of a spreadsheet. Which is the latest and the correct version of the spreadsheet, and can I store this in an enterprise content management system so I know that this is the real version of a spreadsheet, and that's not going to come back and hurt me. So that's, again, a little bit of difference between master data management and information governance to be able to do that. So the type of questions that we typically see these programs addressing are as follows. Well, classic information governance or records management. Which of our documents are records? And by the way, how do we define a record? Where do they exist? How do we identify the copy of record? How do we make the official copy? How do we save it for the right period of the time? And how do we, at some point in time, get rid of the rest? I mean, that's really the kernel of records management and what has driven much of information governance programs. How can we manage the most current version of any given document? We talked about that. How can we still get our employees to better share and collaborate information? Hey, as long as we got information, as opposed to everybody having their own copy, can we better share information across the organization? We find the whole employee productivity and collaboration, we've described this on past webinars as sort of the money slide. This is the one thing that really drives effective information governance programs. But it doesn't in there. How do we better control documents and electronic information if we face litigation? That's always a tricky issue. And again, one of the trends out there is there's just more and more electronic information. It just piles up and piles up. And then when, litigation strikes or regulatory inquiry strikes, you got to hire this really expensive law firm or e-discovery firm. They'll be more than happy to go out and find everything you have, everywhere it might be, and at a very steep price too. And so, the more you have, the more that creates risks. And so, what do we have, and where is it, and can we identify it if we need to, and can we preserve it? And important, if we don't need it, between litigation and between legal holds, can we get rid of it if it's not really necessary? How do we better control documents and electronic information face litigation? And where is our privacy information across all of our repositories? And how do we control it? That's really what information governance tries to do, is to get that level of control. Now, on the data governance side is, how can we leverage that vast amount of data in our databases and make better decisions on it? That's one of the primary drivers, as we talked about. How do we talked about having the same data across different applications, or we can have, if we can have data in different places, but how do we ensure consistency? How do we get some business rules? How do we get cascading in place? So, if somebody makes a change that, customers always hate this. You send in a change of address, and some parts of the organization get it, but some parts don't, and that makes you not look good in front of your customers. How can we ensure that the data we do have is accurate and consistent? How do we keep our data secure? How do we make sure that we're compliant? And how do we control the flow of privacy between in and out of applications? And I'm going to take one step. How do we make sure that if we have data flowing between applications, that we can meet cross-border data privacy requirements? Big area for a lot of organizations. The big debate that we're seeing coming up in data governance is, and especially around data privacy, is on one hand, the compliance, the privacy experts in-house are saying, you know, there's some new rules out here, and we really got to be careful. And especially look at some of the new rules coming out of the EU, huge areas for them to be able to manage. And how do we do that? And the business is saying, well, we need to use this information because we need to keep running the business. We need to sell to people. We need to run marketing and sales programs. And we want to understand our customers. And so there's that delicate balance happening in there with data governance. It's quickly becoming a data governance issue above and beyond just a data privacy. Again, I'll repeat the point. The one area, the biggest area of intersection between these two is usually typically data privacy. But I'll make the point that having complementary initiatives is important. So as an example, and this is an area that a lot of organizations have not really looked at. Does big data really mean that we have permanent retention? So we see a lot of big data initiatives that say, hey, we'll tie this database, and we'll take this database, and we'll take this database, and man, we've got all this unstructured data out here. Maybe they're files, or maybe they're email. Do we want to suck those up into our big data? Yeah, but the question is, well, we sort of have conflicting initiatives. You know, we have to make sure that, well, if we're going to have a record retention, are we going to retain it for the right period of time, and perhaps not over-retain it, and that's often dictated by a record retention policy. And then likewise, how do we make sure that if we have a data privacy policy that talks about security, accessibility, and again, the emerging need to forget requirement that we can forget if an individual, and again, this is coming out of the EU, wants to be forgotten, can we give somebody the right to be forgotten? Can you get rid of everybody's data? And by the way, we predict it won't be too long before you see states coming up with similar types of requirements on the need to be forgotten and erase the data. Well, again, these are sort of retention and privacy issues. Is that the same as your strategy for big data? And again, this is where we begin to see some of the overlap between the two different areas or projects. Okay, so let's get a little bit more in detail. If we take the different areas between information governance and data governance, and we look at the two, where do we see an overlapping between the two? Where are they the same, or where are they complementary? And yet again, just going through the list, legal hold and record requirements, legal hold and discovery, control of corporate confidential information, yes, in there. But if we start looking at data privacy, we think that there is a very nice complementary activity between defining your data privacy, and matter of fact, your data security classification policy, into data security and information security. A good data security classification policy that will be consistent with your record retention policy, if written well, can be very helpful when defining your data security policy and your information security policy. The information governance looks at the information components of that. It's respectful of all the regulations and the privacy. The data security and information security says, okay, how do I actually enforce that? What's my strategy? So one feeds nicely into the other. Another area that we see feeds in nicely is the area of data mapping. Data mapping for data privacy, data mapping for e-discovery, data mapping for collaboration, data mapping for record retention. And again, we've got a lot of webinars. We talked about data mapping. A good data map, a well-defined data map, feeds into and supports a similar, albeit different activity of metadata or data dictionary definition. Data map is, what do you have today and where does it live? A metadata data dictionary really defines your hierarchy of what data, what is your sole source of data and where does it live? And so again, I'll make an argument that these are different activities, but one feeds into the other. We have seen organizations that have tried to drive their data mapping strategy via a data dictionary project. And that works okay for structured data. It falls on its face when you look at unstructured or semi-structured data because there's just not the same level different from a control perspective, and also where the data resides. So one feeds nicely into the other. All right. Does it end there? Employee productivity and collaboration. How can we make sure that we share the right information? How can we make them more productive? How, if an employee needs to find something, can they spend minimum time searching for something and make it useful? This is typically at the document level, whether it be an email or a file or some other type of unstructured information. Well, that sort of feeds into documents control. There are parts of data governance that say, well, this information may not only be useful for employees, but this, quite frankly, is a good guide. If it's useful for employees, this may be something that could feed our data governance and our big data project. So again, slightly different, but one will feed into the other. And then finally, document retention and disposition. What do you have? Where is it? How long do you keep it? When can you get rid of it? And how do you do that consistently across the organization? Information governance, when well executed, does a pretty good job of that, and I think that's something that can drive your data governance strategy. And it goes back to the question of, well, if we have data storage and operations, how can we make sure that data and storage operations understands the retention requirements for data and then be able to execute those? What you don't want to set up is a big data project or big data lake, and we'll talk about those, that has no disposition strategy. And before you know it, the data piles up and piles up and piles up, and then you have no effective way of implementing effective disposition. Because, by the way, if you want to get rid of stuff, you can't just get rid of stuff, because sometimes, again, you have record-keeping requirements. Oftentimes you have legal hold requirements, and so trying to clean that up, again, this is something that we think that you should be able to design effectively into your strategy. And again, some of the other areas like data quality or modeling or master data management or data warehousing, depending on how you define it, you could find some overlap, but let's be careful about not trying to make this more complicated. This is already a bit of an esoteric area between the two. Good information, and I'll repeat the point, good information governance strategies, in our view, will very effectively drive good data governance strategy. And by the way, this doesn't have to be one way or the other. If you have a good data dictionary, that can be very useful in supporting a data map. Or if you've got some data security, that can help in data privacy. It's not a one-way relationship. It can be back and forth, but again, slightly different activities. All right. Probably, I think, the biggest argument to be made on the difference between information governance and data governance is, what are the skills required to make this very effective? I mean, are they the same things? And in our view, no, actually, these are very different. Information governance skills requires, again, a diverse set of skills, here's some of it: good records management background, understanding records management requirements and processes, a key component of information governance. E-discovery and litigation, understanding the legal requirements for complying with hold and discovery processes, key. Privacy, data privacy rules, very important part of it. Doesn't end there. Behavior change management. How can we get employees and have them follow our program, have them comply in a way that they think is beneficial for them? And then we can expand it from there. Enterprise content management. How do we manage and control information? Archiving, whether it's email archiving or file archiving, other components of that. We talked about defensible disposition, enterprise rollout. How do we roll this out? And then we're going to add on, of course, any complex project, you want good project management and communication. Data governance skill sets are often very different. They're data architect. How do we want our data to live? Or data analyst, where's the data live now? How do we understand that? Or what's the workflow between those different data? Obviously, if you've got big stores of data, having a very good information security background, being able to make sure that both your data at rest and your data in transit is secured appropriately. Very important part for information security. I would argue that it would be very difficult for any data governance team to be effective if they didn't have a very strong grounding in relational or other types of database systems, object-oriented databases, other things like that. A key component, because you have to understand how these applications, where the data is stored and how these have it. And then I'm going to go one step further and say, well, big data, to the extent that that is an extension of that, both for the big data and the non-relational systems. Once we're into there, we talk about the data modeling and the integration, the warehousing, and again, the project management and communication. If somebody were to come to me and say, I've got a team here of information governance, and here are the people on it, and I've got a team of data governance, my first reaction would be, these are excellent skill sets to have in each. The one area that I may want to add between the two is, wouldn't hurt to have your information governance folks to have at least some experience in the data governance world, and vice versa, the data governance to have some experience in the information governance tool. But at the same time, and I've sort of said this before, if you think this information governance team can do a really good data governance, if this skill set for information governance, could they do a great job on data governance? Probably not. And likewise, if these are the people that you're putting on data governance, you hope will also have information governance, I would say just the data governance skills will fall well short of your ability to execute and get the end results you want for information governance. So again, this is probably the one area that if again, we're moving away from definitions. We're talking about what drives it, what does it do, and most important, what are the skills to be required. Complementary, sort of sounding the same, but when we get down to it, different. So what are the big challenges of big data? How can information governance help a big data project? Well, we alluded to this earlier as preservation. Big data is considered electronically stored information. If you run into, and we've seen this before, if you run into litigation or if you run into some type of regulatory inquiry, how do you do preservation? How do you do collection? How do you do review? How do you do production? You know, where does big data live? Well, maybe in your production application or in your data warehouse or in a hosted application or someplace like there. And likewise, big data may have very dynamic data. I mean, if you have social media feeding into that, very dynamic data set. What constitutes a legal hold? I mean, these are really key questions that organizations have to figure out. And we think it's important, and again, this is not the dominating part of your big data project, but this is one of those small details that it's a good thing to figure out ahead of time, which is, wow, if we ever have to do legal hold, can we design the legal hold and identification and review process as we launch our big data? Because we don't want to wake up one day and say, oops, we forgot that, because that could get very painful and very expensive if you need to go and do some type of discovery out there. And so I know a lot of this, big data is a big topic within the world of information governance, in part because this is one of the key questions that organizations have to face. Here's a good case study. A large multinational corporation, they receive an investigative subpoena from DOJ. Tell us about your pricing. What about distribution in industry? What's happening there? And the problem is, well, our pricing, you know, good news, bad news. The good news is we think we're really smart at pricing because we have a dynamic system to be able to help us determine what the big pricing is, and we do this lots of different data sources, sales pricing, RFID data, click streams, other stuff like that to help us figure this. And by the way, this is not at all atypical of many projects that we're seeing out there. And the feeds can include lots of different areas. Okay, you need to do a legal hold on that. Well, what does that mean? How do we define that? How can we make that defensible? Does that mean we have to journal everything? How can we actually do, you know, how can we search that data for both relevance and privilege? How do we produce this? These are all key questions to be able to do. And what you don't want to do is not define this, and then you end up sort of doing backup. And by the way, if you've got a real-time data feed, and even if you do data backups, one could argue that if all of your data feeds are not persistent, at least through the period of your backup windows, you may not be in compliance with the discovery request. And so the other problem we're finding, and this is especially true with the DOJ, we've seen this before, or you could also throw in the FTC with this, the Federal Trade Commission. If you're not quick to respond, you can invite a bigger and wider investigation. And so the other risk is, well, I'm sure we can figure this out, but we've seen with some of our clients, and they had this problem and called us in, is if you're not really fast, they can say, oh, they're being really slow, maybe there is something here, and then they broaden their request for information. And they can do that, and all of a sudden you've turned what was a small to mid-sized problem into a big problem. And again, good area where a good information governance strategy, which can include legal hold, when engineered into your data governance, can make you more successful. But again, I'll argue that a key part of those skills on figuring out how we can do this compliantly, defensively, and cost effectively come from the information governance side of the equation. What's another risk for big data projects? Well, we've seen this. Let's go vacuum up all the data. Hey, we got all these files out here. We got emails. We got, we got social media feeds. We got all this information. There's some great stuff like this. If we pile all of this stuff into our big data database, it's going to be useful. And you're absolutely right. You can, but one of the risks that we see out there is if you just sort of inadvertently vacuum everything out, do you know the content in there? The risk that you have out there is that some of that content may be privacy related, PCI, PHI. Some of it may be corporate confidential or other types of sensitive information. Part of it may be, privileged information. Lots of different, part of it may be IP or other things like that. And so we've seen this before. Well, that's not supposed to be there. And matter of fact, according to our master data management model, that's not where this data should be. Okay, I agree with you. We don't want, PHI sitting, protecting healthcare information sitting out there in the file share. But the fact is, it is. And part of information governance is being able to police and ensure that you've got well-classified data and you know where it is and you don't get the wrong stuff in the wrong place. And by the way, you can say it shouldn't be there and there's probably not much, but in the aggregate, if you go through a lot of this, you could actually have a fair amount of privacy or other type of confidential information which is living in the wrong place. And so, again, just be real careful. I know, well, hey, we'll just go vacuum up this and vacuum up that and put that all and ingest that and make that part of our big data. Careful, careful, careful. And by the way, I'm not saying you don't want to do that. You just want to be careful what you put in there so you can be compliant, get out there. So the other issue where this is becoming important is that we are beginning to see, we're fearful of, by the way, we're not positioning ourselves as technology Luddites. We like big data. We think it's very helpful for organizations to make good decisions, but let's be careful because as the big data stores will continue to grow, we alluded to big data preservation discovery requests coming not only from savvy clients, but again, you're getting this growing corpus of data and the discovery requests will come up. And what we worry about, probably the biggest thing, are sort of the backlash about it and both the anonymization issues of that, the re-anonymization or de-anonymization of data when you have multiple, bits and pieces of an individual consumer, but if you can put all those pieces together, you could get a very clear picture of who that consumer is, some of it which in the aggregate may represent privacy information. And again, I think the big risk is not only EU, starting in the EU, but coming out to other places where governments and to some extent consumers are going to say, how much do you know about me and how much do you have? And it's not really a sin of commission. It's not like you grab somebody's credit report and put it in there, but you grab a lot of different pieces over there. And actually Google just announced today that for a case that ended up in Spain for Europe where they have to give consumers the ability to opt out of search requests. Good example of how organizations will be forced to comply with opt-out requests. Part of this is a big data problem, but part of this can be driven by an effective and smart data security classification. Part of it comes from a good information governance, a good data privacy program, and a good data mapping. All of those things will put you in a much better position that will limit the risk that one of these kinds of problems will bite you. And again, we're all most organizations are somewhat new to big data. And it's cool to start out with, but we have to also think about the road, not only the risk today, but the risk coming down the road. Because what we don't want to do is make big data a major part of our organization and have it sidelined because we didn't take all the information governance risks into account. So again, what do you have? What is it? Is it stored securely? Is it compliant with HIPAA and other regulations? If you put in your big data store, even inadvertently, are we going to be compliant with the regulations? Let's be careful. Do we know what's happening with the EU data privacy mandates? Can we preserve it for legal hold? Can you identify it? By the way, are you making your big data system of record? Probably not a good idea. But is that your strategy? Do you expire records? Is it going to live in the big data system whether? And it goes back to the other issue, which is at a certain point, data loses its value. And at what point can we get rid of the data? And then how do we demonstrate if we're doing all these things and a regulator comes in, can we say, hey, we clean things up and let me show you how? Okay, these are all these tasks that we mentioned for avoiding the backlash. These are sort of classical information governance activities, again, applied to effectively help out big data. And so information governance impact on data design considerations, and we like to break it down into 4 areas. The privacy and sensitive information, defining what type of PII you have in your system, determining if re-identification will cross the threshold. We talked about that. If I've got lots of pieces of data, can I be sure that we're not going to cross the threshold? Can we ensure appropriate controls? The legal hold and discovery, we talked a lot about that. Make sure that's a component of it. The records management, what you don't want to do is saying, well, my official system of record is over here, and we're going to delete it after 3 years, but after 8 years, it still lives in my big data system. All that does is puts more burden on your big data system. And by the way, there's a business decision to be made. If I've got a record here that I need to keep from a regulatory perspective for only 3 years, do I want to keep it longer? Maybe I have value as part of my big data for 5 years or 6 years. Well, let's make a conscious decision out there. Let's not make a de facto decision because it happens to be in one place or the other, and let's be smart about it where one can drive the other. And by the way, the flip side of that, and we're going to see more of this, hey, I have some consumer information here that not only am I not only supposed to keep for 2 years, I need to get rid of after 30 days after reasonable use, and so I then have to get good at disposition. And part of right to forget. So that's the final component of having one program drive into the next, helping you. And again, I'll make my point again. We think of the organizations that we work with, and we work with more than 30% of the Fortune 500, we think that those that have complementary initiatives tend to be very successful. And matter of fact, the information governance and the data governance groups aren't fighting, but they sort of like each other. So be smart about this, thinking about the considerations that you need to go to for that. And so as you fill your big data lake with your structured data and your semi-structured data and your web and your cloud feeds, you could know what's going in there. You could know the type of information. You won't be surprised. And it's interesting, the better you know what's going in there, the better you have filters for making sure privacy or intellectual property or confidential sensitive information or records, the better job you do of identifying the stuff you need to be careful about. Quite frankly, the more that opens you to be liberal about the other stuff. And it's interesting. I'm going back to this big debate. How do we make sure that we maintain privacy requirements and we balance those with business use? And I can make the argument, the better you understand your privacy requirements, the better you understand your unstructured data, the better you understand your records, it will free you up to really understand where you can be effective and where you can understand it. If you sort of ignore those problems, that in the long run is going to greatly limit your ability to leverage your information, your data, to make those smart business decisions, which are driving a lot of these projects. So as you look at your Lake Hadoop, be careful what you do on there. Make sure you have the unknown sensitive information, the known sensitive information, the data residency requirements. Again, the big issue, again, part of that, as well as the corporate confidential. What's in your data sources that you don't inadvertently. And by the way, from a percentage basis, this could be a very small percentage of what you have, but it doesn't take a lot to contaminate your big lake data. And that's the other point. We want to make sure that if we put these together, we don't get that level of contamination, because it may only be 0.1% or half of a percent, a very small amount. It doesn't take much to contaminate that. And then your whole idea of, well, we're going to have systems to be able to limit that. Be careful on that. By the way, some big data is good at identifying things like Social Security numbers, other things like that. Hey, those are the easy part of it. I'm not talking about that. There are other types of privacy information, other types of sensitive information. Employment history. State of Alaska considers that sensitive information. So don't think, oh, we've searched for all Social Security numbers, we're okay. Again, let's use the information governance and privacy to understand what type of information as, so we can be smart about the content, so we can be smart about moving forward for what we need and having that. And so, again, the ultimate goal here is that we have a very clean and compliant Lake Hadoop, and We can de-identify the stuff, we can ensure compliance, and we're not getting in trouble, and we can use it. That's really what we want to do, so we can be smart about having that work. All right, we're about to jump into our question period. And so before we do, well, as we're doing that, ask lots of questions. We've got a good set of questions here already. Let's put them in the chat field. Send your questions in. I don't know if we'll get a chance to answer all the questions. We have a lot of good attendees on this today. But I'm going to briefly talk about Contoural. Contoural is the largest independent provider of information governance consulting services in the U.S. We're independent. We don't sell any products or take any referral fees or store any documents or do any reactive e-discovery. We have attorneys on staff. We have data architects on staff. We have certified records managers and privacy professionals. We've got a very diverse group of people that understand both information governance and data governance. And we help organizations get a real impact. So some of the things that we do as part of our consulting services are assessments and roadmaps and policy development and data placement, privacy programs and data mapping and legal hold and change management and disposition, as well as help organizations set up their organizational development. Our clients like us because whereas we understand the regulatory and the compliance areas very well, we don't get caught in the theoretical. We help them drive real-world solutions to real-world programs. And this is a great example, helping them figure out how do we be smart both about information governance and data governance for both of those. Now, if you've been paying close attention today, you'll notice that we skipped over a tremendous amount of information. We have a lot of white papers available on our website at Contoural.com, how to prevent employees from hoarding documents, auto-classification, ROI, archiving, as well as lots of good articles out there. Take a look at this information, all available on a complimentary basis. We just added a new white paper on retiring legacy applications, very popular area. Very good white paper, smart ways to be able to do that. So take a look at that. And the other thing I want to offer is that if you've got your committee, or if you've got two committees, if you've got your information governance committee, which has legal and records and privacy, and maybe you have a data governance committee, we're more than happy to come on site for a 2-hour seminar, complimentary, talk about information governance responsibilities, how do you comply, where do these fit together. We've done a lot of these, just did one of these, a couple of these this week for Fortune 100 companies. It's not a sales pitch for us. It's really good content. We're happy to give you some very good referrals of organizations that have these. So if you're interested in an on-site seminar and we can customize it for your organization, let us know. Send us an email. Go to our website. We're happy to do that. We can also offer, by the way, a number of CRM or CLE, other types of professional credits if you're interested in the on-site seminar. And so finally, upcoming webinars, well, we just talked about it. Preparing for the EU 215 data protection rules. What do you need to know? What can we determine about these new coming rules? That will be next month. Developing unstructured data placement strategies. Where do you put your data? Enterprise content management and SharePoint strategies. So lots of good webinars available on our website for replay. Dodd-Frank, Office 365, where's your privacy data, and creating a records management project plan. All available for replay, all available for replay on a complimentary basis, similar to this one. Okay, let's see if we can get in the questions. Curious how information governance and enterprise architecture overlap. I'm addressing both, and I see the two colliding a bit. Yeah, that's a really good question. It depends. Information governance, as I alluded to, the 5 drivers that talk about what you need and what you have and where it lives and how you do that. Enterprise architecture could mean 2 different things. Enterprise architecture could mean something like enterprise content management. How do I set up an enterprise content management system or a records management system? How do I define the one copy of a document and know where to save that? It also could mean, well, we talked about this, master data management, data analytics, other things like that, or it could be a combination of all the above. So what I think is helpful is, as opposed to getting stuck on the definitions of the terms, let's talk about what we're trying to do and accomplish, and then let's talk about the skill sets, and I think that will help ferret out the difference between the two. But again, if you look to industry sources for an official definition, you're more likely to get confused. Go think about what you need to do and how you need to approach it. All right, we've got time for a couple more questions here. And the next question is, do you ever see joint information governance and data governance committees? And the answer is yes. In some cases, we do. We see a sort of a working committee, a steering committee that comprises both. It's different types of projects. What typically we see more often, though, is you may have an information governance committee and a data governance committee, and they oftentimes feed up to a similar steering committee. That's probably more typical. And the reason is that oftentimes, you know, we've got so much on our plate for each. Do we really want to have one group or one committee? And that tends to be, but not always. We've seen some both. And again, I want to be real world about this. I know everybody's competing for funds. Everyone's competing for initiatives. I'm going to make the argument that if you define each of these roles well, and you use some of the guidelines that we talked about in this webinar, and you're smart about what you do, there's room for both. As a matter of fact, I think there's tremendous business benefit for both. I think the data governance are always afraid that the information governance folks are going to, you know, steal the thunder, steal the funding, and vice versa. And you know, let's relax. Let's all get along, because I think there's a great job to be done for both of them. As a matter of fact, they both have such good business benefits, and quite frankly, they're oftentimes tapping into different pots of money. So let's be smart about it. Let's design complementary initiatives, and let's show the business value in both benefit of each. How can an information governance group help with an organization's big data efforts? I think that's a great one. And the first one is, my advice to this is, opposed to saying, you know, hey, we've got us and you've got you, and how, you know, conflicting with them, how can we help you? Let me talk about some things we want to do. Let me talk about how it's different, and how can we use that to help you, and the other way around, because we see a lot of overlay between the two that are doing it. I think one definitely drives the other. I think when we talked about the legal hold, when we talked about the record retention, we talked about defensible disposition. These are all strategies which can greatly inform a good data governance or big data project, helping them figure out each one that they're working on. So really good question, and I think we have time just for one more question as we go through, and this one's coming right up. All right. Organizations think enterprise architecture is buying the leading edge data or tools. Any ideas how to fix it? Oh, great point. Too often data governance, well, too often all IT projects, and too often especially data governance or big data, are a technology-led initiative. Let's buy a tool, and our job is to execute that tool. I think this is true both for information governance and data governance projects. That's a mistake. What you want to do, we think, is understand what are we trying to achieve from a business perspective. How do we then get those functional requirements, and from those, how do those drive the technology? Have your strategy drive your technology. Don't have your technology drive the strategy. If you're having a technology-focused or a tool-focused strategy, you will probably end up with a 50%, and I got some statistics on this. If you're interested, write me. A 50% effectiveness on your overall efforts. And so, ironically, the best way to make the best use of your tool is to think of the business problem first and use that to drive it. Be careful about saying that this is a technology-driven project. All right. With that, we are about out of time today. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to answer all your questions. If you could please complete the webinar survey form. We pay very close attention to this. What did you like? Where can we improve? What did we talk about? What did we not talk about you wanted to hear? Just spend 60 seconds or a couple minutes on this. We would greatly appreciate it. This is very important to us, and so fill that out at the end of today's webinar. And so with that, I want to thank you for attending today. Take a look at our website. If you're struggling with these issues, we're more than happy to come with an on-site seminar. Again, we are independent. We're the largest information governance consulting firm. And most important, we wish you success as you develop both your information and your complementary data governance strategies. There's a good fit there, and there's a benefit for everybody. Be smart about it. This webinar will be available for replay at no charge in a couple days. So we wish you success. Thank you very much.